right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to week number 18 of a 19-week series. So next week will be our final week together as will have gone verse by verse through the Gospel of John. But today we pick it up in week number 18. Now let's remind ourselves, and I've been saying this every week because I want you for the rest of your life to understand this when it comes to the genre or the family, if you will, of what it means to read a gospel. Genre is a different a type of literature. It's a literary type, like there's a genre of poetry, the genre of history. Well, gospel is a genre. And in the very first week, we did the whole history and the whole background behind the word gospel. But what it's come to be today is it's a combination, a hybrid of a first century Greco-Roman biography plus a sermon or preaching about Jesus. And those two hybrids were combined into what is now known as a gospel, a good news, a declaration of good news. And it's the gospel according to John. John, we believe, was John, one of the 12 disciples, one of the three closest companions of Jesus, James, Peter, and John. And he also wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, also wrote the book of Revelation. And so he was at the least the editor of the material that is now part of what is known as the Gospel of John. And so we've gone from the very beginning of John's Gospel, from the prologue where you get inside information about who this Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So as we're reading this gospel, as readers, we have inside information that the people that Jesus was bumping up against didn't have. We realize this is God in flesh, and we're watching Jesus walk out his life over these several chapters. And so then we went from the beginning, from Jesus' a public ministry. We watched as Jesus gradually revealed himself to the masses, and we saw the tension that increased and that rose with this gradual revealing. And then last time we were together, the last couple of weeks, we've looked at Jesus' final speech to and then his final prayer with and for his followers. And the last time we were together, Jesus walked from the Temple Mount across the Kidron Valley up onto the side of the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane, literally the Garden of the Winepress, where Jesus often would go to pray. And it was there that he was arrested by the Roman authorities, and Roman and Jewish authorities, I should say. And a combination of these two powers, the civil power and the religious power, got together and arrested him. And that's where we pick things up in chapter 18, verse 12. Chapter 18, verse 12 of John's Gospel. And the first blank on your outline is this, that Jesus is before the Jewish authorities. Jesus then goes before the Jewish authorities. Now, before we read this passage, let's fill in that box on your outline. The whole high priest scenario, because there's been some mystery over the years of what's going on here. Biblically, the office of the high priest was to be a lifelong term. So, biblically speaking, when you were appointed the high priest, you would be the high priest until you died. But this changed by the first century as the role had become highly politicized. Now, Annas was the high priest from AD 6 till AD 15, the year of our Lord 6 to the year of our Lord 15, when Pilate's predecessor, so again, remember, Pilate is the Roman authority that's come in. Let me even go back a bit further, just so we have a clear understanding. Herod the Great was in charge of this region. Herod the Great's the one who had all the babies killed in Bethlehem at Jesus' birth. Well, Herod the Great was overseeing this whole region. He was sort of a Jew, but not really a Jew. He was sort of a mesh of the two. But he ruled this area on behalf of the Romans. And when in his will, he had his sons, Philip, Archelaus, and there's one more, Antipas. Thank you. Had them appointed over different regions. And so he divided up his kingdom, and his sons would be given geographical regions. Well, the one, Archelaus, who was to oversee the area of Judea, Jerusalem area, with Jerusalem as the core of it, he did such a terrible job that he was fired, and the Romans sent in a prefect, a Roman governor, to be in that person's place. And so Pilate was the most recent of those Roman governors. So Herod's sons were overseeing the other regions, but the key region, the Judea, the Jerusalem region, was now being ruled or overseen, governed, is the best word, by Pontius Pilate. And so Pilate's predecessor, the one before him, had removed Annas as the chief priest and put someone else in place, one of Annas's children, as it turns out. So over the next few years, 5 of Annas's sons held the position. And at the time of Christ's trial, Annas's son-in-law, Caiaphas, fulfilled that official role. Now, like modern-day U.S. presidents, those who form, like they still refer to President Trump and President Obama and President Carter, they still are given those titles, okay? President Carter, President Trump, President Obama, even though they're no longer the acting presidents. Well, it was the same when it came to the high priest. They would still refer to the former high priest with that title, okay? And now here's the next blank in your outline. Many scholars believe that the typical Jews of Jesus' day regarded Annas as the true high priest, and he remained the puppet master behind the scenes. Okay? So they regarded him as the true high priest, and he remained the puppet master behind the scenes. As your outline says, letter A, upon being arrested, Jesus is bound and brought before Annas. So Jesus is arrested, bound, and he's brought before Annas. Well, let's pick it up, verse 12 of chapter 18. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Okay? As your outline says, letter B, John reminds his readers that the verdict has been rendered long before the trial. So John reminds his readers, as we're about to see, that the verdict has been rendered long before the trial. Look at verse 14. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So in other words, they decided long ago, okay, this Jesus has to die. It's politically expedient. He's got to die. So we have to, have this kangaroo court and make up a trial and make it look good, but Jesus has to be killed somehow. They've been plotting this for a long time. Letter C in your outline. Peter and an unnamed disciple, not necessarily one of the 12. Remember, Jesus had all sorts of disciples. We have the 12 apostles, but there were other disciples as well. This unnamed disciple followed the entourage to the high priest's courtyard. That's your next blank. They followed the entourage to the high priest's courtyard. We read it in verses 15 to 16. Simon Peter and another disciple, this is an anonymous, unnamed disciple, were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. As your outline says, then the anonymous disciple had a level of relationship with the high priest that granted him access to the private courtyard of the residence. So this unnamed disciple had a relationship with the high priest's family, the high priest's entourage, if you will, that he got access behind the gate into the courtyard. And so Peter is then brought in. And then we have letter D in your outline, Peter's first denial. Peter's first denial. Let's read verse 17. Bruce, could you get the sound guys to come down? I have a ring on my voice. So up somewhere, find Paulo or someone. Thank you, my friend. First of all, we have Peter's first denial, looking at verse 17. Says, you aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So we have Peter's first denial here. And as your outline says, letter E, John specifies that Peter stood with the others around a charcoal fire. That's important because that's going to come next week. That's going to be important to remember. The Greek word is anthrakion, which means a heap or a bed of burning coals. So it's a heap of coals or it's a bed of burning coals. So remember that detail because that's going to come in handy next week. All right, next, letter F on your outline. Annas begins to question Jesus. Annas begins to question Jesus. Let's look at verse 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. So Annas, who's not the high priest, he's viewed as the official high priest by many, but at that moment, technically speaking, his son-in-law Caiaphas was the high priest. But they bring Jesus to Annas because he's really the boss. He's the one in control, most people think. So they bring him to Jesus first. Letter G, Jesus seems to be pointing out the fact that Annas is not following Jewish legal protocol of beginning a trial with testimonies on behalf of the defendant. That was the law at the time. That was Jewish protocol. You began a trial. We tend to do it in our system with the prosecution first, puts on their case, and then the defense. But here it should have begun with testimonies on behalf of the defendant. And Jesus seems to be pointing out, you're not following protocol here. Look at verses 20 to 21. Jesus says, I've spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. So he's saying, why are you not bringing people to testify on my behalf here, on my defense? Why are you not asking for, witnesses? And then, as your outline says, one of the officials slaps Jesus in response to his statement. One of them slaps Jesus in response to his statement. Verse 22. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him. This would have been one of the Jewish officials. Slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. Now notice that. He refers to Annas as the high priest. Because he hasn't gone to Caiaphas yet. So you can see how they had this double understanding of who the high priest was. All right. Letter I in your outline. Jesus doubles down on his observation and asks for a justification for the slap. He asked for a justification of the slap. We see it in verse 23. Jesus says, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? All right. Letter J on your outline. Realizing he'll get nowhere with his questions, Annas sends Jesus to his son-in-law for further questioning. John does not include that interaction in his gospel. So Annas sends Jesus then to Caiaphas, the acting high priest, the actual high priest, but John doesn't include that. Other gospel writers do, but John does not. We see it in verse 24. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now remember what we learned about first century biographies. You could include whatever material you wanted to include. You could rearrange the material if you wanted. It didn't have to be chronological. You could arrange it according to a theme if you'd like. And so John simply does not include Jesus, what happens essentially when he's before Caiaphas, because it just wasn't important to John. And most likely he knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already included it. John was the last of the Gospels to be written that we have in their Bible. All right, then we have letter K, Peter's second and third denials. His second and third denials. Verses 25 to 27, let's read that. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Now this is, again, eyewitness information. This is level of detail that would only be known by eyewitnesses. Where was I? You are one of his chief priest servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off back in the garden, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. All right. Then, number 2 on your outline, Jesus goes then before the Roman authorities. We've just seen him before the Jewish authorities. Then he's transferred to the Roman authorities. And as your outline says, Jesus is taken to the Praetorium, the Roman governor's Jerusalem headquarters. So he's taken to the Praetorium, the Roman governor's Jerusalem headquarters. We see that in verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness. On your Bible, underline that, ceremonial uncleanness, cleanness. We'll get to that in a second. To avoid that, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Okay, so as your outline says, if the Jewish leaders wanted to participate in the Passover ceremonies, they could not step foot into a Gentile's home, meaning a non-Jew's home, as that would render them ceremonially unclean. Ceremonially unclean. Now this is important, and Pastor Nathan refers to this morning in his teaching, in his sermon, that, because we can misunderstand this, to be unclean did not mean to be sinful. There's a difference. We tend to read that. Oh, you're unclean, that means you've done something sinful. You've eaten a food that's unclean, you have sinned. No. To touch a tomb or get near a tomb would render you ceremonially unclean. That's why many of the tombs were painted white. Jesus talked about you whitewashed tombs. What is he saying that? They would paint the tombs white so you would know, stay away from that. That's a tomb. That's why Jesus said, you're a whitewashed tomb. You're all white and clean on the outside, but you're full of dead bones on the inside. So it was an illustration he was using. But to be unclean was not sinful, and neither did it mean to be unsanitized. Like there were certain emissions of the body that would render you ceremonially unclean. So unclean doesn't mean you're physically dirty. It doesn't mean you're sinful. It means you were you're religiously contaminated. And it was all part of God's way of teaching in the Old Testament. He was trying to teach his people the difference between holy and unholy, pure and impure before God. And so he's made some foods ceremonially clean and unclean. So you can't eat this, but you can eat that. Why? Is it because that food's bad? No. But it was just God's way of separating. It was an object lesson. That's why today, Jesus in the New Testament, all foods are clean. You can eat any food now. Why? Because are they suddenly sanitized? No. The purpose had been achieved. Okay? It would be like, for example, in the Old Testament, if you had a certain disease or whatever, you had to walk through the streets yelling, unclean, unclean, unclean. Kind of funny if you think about it, having to walk through the hallways of Broadway. Unclean, unclean. It would be like if you hadn't been vaccinated during the COVID. Unvaccinated, unvaccinated, unvaccinated. It'd be similar. I am potentially contagious. And don't email me about your views on that stuff. It's just an illustration. They're saying, you're religiously contagious. I am ceremonially unclean. I have touched a dead body. I'm unclean. Don't get near me, because if you touch me, then you'll be ceremonially unclean, and you'll have to go and do all these religious rites so you can be clean again. Clean, not physically. So you haven't sinned, but you have rendered yourself unclean. And so in this situation, it was they couldn't go into Pilate's home or his residence or his office because that is Gentile territory. So they couldn't go in, or otherwise they'd be ceremonially unclean and they couldn't participate in the Passover. So that's what John is saying here. So, as your outline says, letter B, trying to avoid stirring things up during a religious holiday, Pilate respects their wishes. Nonetheless, he pushes back against their wishes at the same time. And this is classic Pilate. He respects their wishes and pushes back against their wishes at the same time. We see verse 29. So Pilate came out to them. So they couldn't go into him. So he comes out to them. He could have played the power game. Says, well, I'm the boss here. You come in, you do it my way. But he didn't. Why did he not play the power game? We're going to unpack that in the next couple moments. This is fascinating. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? So get the full picture of what is really about to take place here. We need to get a bit of the backstory, and I find this fascinating. Historians tell us that Pontius Pilate was an incredibly ambitious man, okay? He was doing everything he could to please Tiberius Caesar because he wanted out of Judea and he wanted to go somewhere else. So like he was a political appointee. He was like an ambassador for Rome. But going to Israel would be like being sent to Afghanistan today. It was like the lowest on the totem pole of places a Roman governor could be sent. So he's trying to do his best to jump through all the hoops and be a really good governor so that he can get transported out of Judea into a better place, okay? And he was highly ambitious. So he was doing everything he could to please Tiberius Caesar. But his ambitious nature had been working against him lately. Now, on this day, as Jesus was standing on trial before him, Pilate was standing on very thin ice before Caesar. A few years before this trial of Jesus, Pilate caused a riot in Jerusalem when he had his Roman troops march into the city of Jerusalem carrying flags and medallions with images of the Roman emperor on them. Again, he thinks he's parading the flag and he's showing Caesar what a team member he is, but the Jewish people, how dare you do this? This is our holy city, and you're bringing in flags and medallions of this pagan leader who claims to be a god. This infuriated the Jews, and they considered it blasphemy. So the Jews unleashed a riot that lasted for 5 days. People died, property was destroyed before Pilate finally backed down and he removed the images. But he's stubborn, he's proud, he's ambitious. So a little while later, Pilate's at it again. He was sick of the poor drinking water in Jerusalem, so he starts building an aqueduct from Bethlehem, which is like just 6 miles away, just a few kilometers away, and he starts building an aqueduct from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to improve Jerusalem's water supply. But he financed this project by stealing money from the temple treasury in Jerusalem. This sparked another riot, with Pilate's troops getting very aggressive and killing several Jews in the uprising. Word gets back to Caesar in Rome, and Caesar is not impressed at all. So Pilate was informed that he needed to change how he was handling the Jewish people. He needed to stop provoking them or he would be removed from his position. So Pilate tries to calm down his ambitious nature, but he couldn't help himself. So one day, Pilate sets up some golden shields in his office, in his Jerusalem apartment, with several flags that had insignia honoring Tiberius Caesar on them. Again, the Jews protested against such blasphemy in their holy city right by their temple. And once again, they began to riot and protest. Pilate dug in his heels that time, refused to take the flags down. So Caesar was informed of this skirmish, and he wrote a nasty letter to Pilate. And he informed Pilate that Pilate was on thin ice, that he needed to immediately stop provoking the Jewish subjects, and that Caesar himself was watching things very closely. And historians tell us that Pilate received that letter of warning from Caesar 5 months before this day that we're reading about, the day that Jesus was brought before him. So this is fresh. And here we are, 5 months later. We've got an angry mob led by Jewish leaders standing before Pilate with a man they want killed. A man Pilate knew was innocent. So watch as the tension between Pilate and the religious leaders, Pilate and Jesus, Jesus and the religious leaders, watch how this all plays out. So with that background, we're informed on some of the world-class level trolling that goes on between the Jewish leaders and Pilate. Pick it up, verse 29 to 30. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." As your outline says, their response to his question implies they thought they had a prearranged understanding with Pilate. it looks like they're thinking, we had worked this out, the back channels, this had been worked out. That's why they had the Roman guard and everything. The Jewish authorities were working with the Roman authorities. They thought they had this all worked out. This is a big kabuki theater here. This is a kangaroo court. This is all prearranged, as we're about to see here. What's a mob doing before Pilate early on the preparation day? This is all arranged stuff here. So they're saying, what are you asking us that for? You know why we're doing this. If he hadn't committed a crime, we wouldn't have brought him here. Letter D, true to his historically stubborn and arrogant nature, Pilate flexes his authority and demands they provide evidence of a capital offense, meaning an offense that a man could be killed for. So he's stubborn, and he's not going to completely play along here. So he's reminding them who's really in charge here. Read verses 31 to 32. Do you 31, 32. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. So the Jews could not kill anybody, strictly speaking. It had to be a Roman authority to do that. They said, "We don't have authority to do that." This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Then, as your outline says, letter E, Pilate's question confirms that he had been given a heads up. His next question confirms he'd been given a heads up regarding Jesus' arrest. Verse 33, Pilate then went back inside and the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, they hadn't said that. So where's he getting this? He'd been given some forewarning of what was going on and what was going to be brought before him that morning. Where did he get that notion? Here's the strategy that the Jews had come up with. Remember, we'd read earlier that they had said before, after Lazarus had been raised from the dead, they got together and said, "We've got to destroy this guy." And they began to plot how they would do this. Here's their strategy, as your outline says. The Jewish leaders were trying to turn their theological issue into a political crime. That's what they had to do. They had to turn their theological issue into a political crime. They had to somehow force Rome to kill Jesus because they couldn't do it. And so what they do is, okay, Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. So we have an issue with that. We think theologically he's wrong, so we've got to turn that into a crime that Rome will get the attention of Rome. And this was the very dynamic Jesus was trying to avoid for all 3 years of his ministry. We've been talking about it for the last several weeks. Why didn't he just stand up and say, "I'm the Messiah, I'm God in flesh"? Because that would have immediately brought down all of the authority of Rome upon him. Because he would have been a treasonous. He would have been trying to overthrow Rome. So all the while, Jesus is publicly showing signs of his messiahship without outwardly declaring it. He was just letting the tension build, letting the evidence build until the very end when he was prepared to just come right out and say it because he was prepared to be crucified. So this is the very thing Jesus knew would happen and instigated happening by his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But you can see they're doing the very thing he knew they would do. Let's keep reading verses 33 and 34. Pilate went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews? Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" As your outline says, Jesus seems to be saying, "Are you asking if I'm a political king, or are you asking if I'm the Messiah?" My response will differ depending upon which question you're asking. So are you asking if I'm a political king, or are you asking if I'm the Messiah? Depending on which you're asking, my answer will be different. Okay? Are you the king of the Jews, he's asking. Jesus says, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" What are you asking? Is what he says. Verse 35, "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Letter G, Pilate sees the charges are fraudulent. He sees the charges are fraudulent and wants to know what Jesus has done to so upset the Jewish leaders. So letter H, Jesus clarifies the nature of his kingdom. Jesus clarifies the nature of his kingdom. Verse 36, 37. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." When he says, "You say I'm a king," he's saying that's right. That's a figure of speech. You said it, in other words. Jesus says, yes, I'm a king. The reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then verse 38 at the beginning, Pilate has this famous statement, "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. As your outline says, Jesus' religious judge, Caiaphas, had no interest in justice. Jesus' religious judge, Caiaphas, had no interest in justice. Jesus' political judge, Pilate, had no interest in truth. His religious judge, no interest in justice. His political judge had no interest in truth. Letter J. Pilate tries to release Jesus, but the no doubt prearranged mob refuses. So Pilate's trying to release him here. Verse 38. With this, Pilate went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it's your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. I used to wonder how the crowd so quickly turned. Like just the day before, right? They were celebrating Jesus with palm leaves and hail, son of David, and God save us, and so on. And they're welcoming him. And now there's a mob of people calling for his death. I used to think, what happened between that and that? Well, the reality is nothing happened that would cause that. This mob is not the same public crowd that was welcoming Jesus walking into the streets. This is a prearranged mob. This is not grassroots, this is AstroTurf. Okay? This has been, it's like we see lots of times in the news today. Suddenly these groups rising up with these signs that have all been professionally printed. Well, how did that happen? It's the similar here. This is all prearranged. This is the Jewish religious authorities have set this up. Okay? These are not the average man on the street doing this. What's the average man on the street doing, hanging out in front of Pilate's place where they can't even go in or else they'd be unclean? This is prearranged, okay? Letter K. After having Jesus beaten, Pilate tries to release him. So after having Jesus beaten, Pilate tries to release him. Chapter 19, verse 1 to 6. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. So he's innocent. Okay, so I'll have him whipped. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, sign of royalty, and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to him, "Here's the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted. Now notice who's doing the shouting here. Chief priests, their officials. They shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." Then letter L on your outline. The mob's true religious motivation is then exposed in verse 7. It's exposed in verse 7. The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." He's blasphemed. He's claiming to be God in our midst. Okay? And so he must be killed because of this claim. Letter M. Possibly superstitious and affected by his wife's dream. You can read about her dream in Matthew 27. She comes out, well, her husband's on his judge's chamber's chair there. She comes out and says, "Have nothing to do with this innocent man. I had a dream about him and it's troubled me the whole day." So possibly because of that and his superstitious, Pilate questions Jesus all the more. Knowing the futility of answering, Jesus remains silent. Knowing the futility of answering, Jesus remains silent. Verse 8 to 11. When Pilate heard this, that Jesus was claimed to be the Son of God, when he heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Then, in the next few verses, Pilate makes, as your outline says, a final feeble attempt to sway the mob, and then gives into their demands. He gives into their demands, starting at verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting. Now look at this. There's the trolling. Remember all that background we learned? They know Pilate's on thin ice. They know he's been told to keep things peaceful. And keep in mind, they hate Caesar. They hate Rome. But look at the game they're playing. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. Look at this. These are the Jewish religious leaders. "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priest answered. Now notice that's plural, the chief priests. Chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. I mean, this is a game that they're playing. They're trolling at the highest level. They know Pilate has to do what they say. They know they've got him where they want him. And they know they're going to force Pilate's hand. "We have no king but Caesar." They hated anything about Rome. Okay? Well then, number 3 on your outline. The crucifixion and burial of Jesus. The crucifixion and burial of Jesus. 3a, John describes the horrific events surrounding Jesus' death. Let's pick it up in verse 16. It says, "Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Aramaic is a form of Hebrew. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, 'Don't write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews.' Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.'" As your outline says, Pilate makes a final feeble, the writing on the sign was Pilate's final poke at the Jewish leaders. He said, "Okay, you've got me over a barrel here, but I'm going to poke you even more. He's the King of the Jews, because I know you hate that term, and I know you don't want me to write that, so I'm going to write it." That's his nature. Let's keep reading. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. So they couldn't, were they going to divide that in 4? They didn't know what to do. "This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." That's in Psalm 22. So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, so he's hanging on the cross, he sees his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved, whom has, we've not been given the name yet, We're not quite sure who this is. We later are going to learn it's John who's writing this. So John's there standing nearby. He said to her, this is Jesus from the cross, "Woman, here is your son." And this is that same term he used back at his first miracle. "Woman, why do you bring this to me?" And we learned then it's not a rude term. It's a respectful term. "A woman, here is your son." So pointing to John and nodding to John. He couldn't point, obviously. "And to the disciple, here is your mother." From that time on, the disciple took her into his home. So Jesus, as being the eldest son, is saying, "John, please look after my mother from here on." Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. As your outline says, after refusing a medicated drink prior to the crucifixion, Jesus accepts some liquid in his final moments, enabling him to loudly declare his final words. So I'll say that again. After refusing a medicated drink prior to the crucifixion, Jesus accepts some liquid in his final moments, enabling him to loudly declare his final words. And then letter B, John describes the events surrounding the burial of Jesus, starting at verse 31. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken. Now, why would they do that? Because as we've learned, crucifixion, you died by asphyxiation. You couldn't breathe anymore because of the strain on your lungs, and you'd push up on the nail on your feet and on your arms, and you try to breathe, and then you'd hang down again, and you're constricted in your chest, so you push up, and you up and down. You died of exhaustion. You died of asphyxiation eventually. So to speed up the process, they would break the legs of the person on the cross, so you couldn't push up anymore, and you would die sooner. That's why they would break the legs. The soldiers, therefore, came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified. Think of how cruel this is, by the way. And then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may believe. He's saying, in other words, he's saying, I've seen this myself. And this is, going back to verse 26, the disciple that Jesus loved is there at the foot of the cross. And we are going to later learn next week that the disciple that Jesus loved is the one who's writing this. Okay? So he's simply saying, I saw this, and I'm testifying to you that Jesus died. I saw it myself. These things happened so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. This is after Pilate checked to make sure Jesus was dead. He checked with the people who were crucifying Jesus, and they said, yes, he's dead. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. We're going to stop there for today, and next week we're going to pick up the events around the resurrection of Jesus.